Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and we're not at the end yet, but we're over halfway through our second and last day of the first virtual homeschool conference. This has been really an exciting couple of days, and I sure hope that you're having as much fun as I've had. Our guest today for our penultimate keynote is Yale Wishnick. Yale, welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Really delighted to have you here. Okay, so for those of you who are listening live, this is your chance to let us know where you're participating from. Look for the star to the left of the map. Click on it twice, then click on the map. Give a shout out in the chat as well, maybe the city you're in, the country, the time, the temperature, your general mood. Lainey must be here. I see Peru. Oh, it's not. Oh, yes, it is, Lainey. Lainey's been a terrific supporter through the conference. India, New Zealand. And I don't know how to say your name. Kaya, maybe? I think you and I have corresponded because we just moved to Asheville to be part of this Black Mountain self-organized learning environment, and can't wait to meet you. We'll keep that information flowing. A lot of people joining us from other sessions coming into the room now, but I'm going to move us forward. Thanks so much, Yale. I know that this has been really fun corresponding with you about this session. I'm going to turn the time over to you. If you need my help, I'll be here.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. This is a session that I hope that we'll have some conversation on, questions. It's one that I think in many ways goes to the heart of what this conference is about, and also in terms of what the future may hold for everyone. The title of the conference is the homeschooling movement as a political, economic, and social force for change, how homeschooling can save our country. Obviously, that's reflective of the United States, but I think we can, for our purposes, why don't we just kind of expand that in a sense? You know, we can certainly say save the world in many respects. I want to set the stage quickly, though, for us, that I know it's difficult talking to a lot of parents and teachers that I have, certainly recently, to really move yourself to a political, economic, and social force, dealing with politics, dealing with conflict, the turbulence that we're all facing. That's not really what your interest is in many respects. I'm making an assumption, of course, but it's based on my conversations so much with people dedicated to alternative forms of education, democratizing the education of our children, and certainly in terms of homeschooling. And so it's a challenge, and it's an uncomfortable thing in a sense. But I believe, based on some of my experiences, and I'll be relating those to you as we go through the next few minutes, why I believe what I do, that it's essential for people who are dedicated to the homeschooling movement and everything that represents, and I know it's a very broad definition, to consider the political, economic, and social forces going on. And I've divided this little talk into some themes and then some considerations. And that's all this really is at this point. This is not the truth with a capital T, but rather it's some ideas and thoughts to consider. And we'll leave time, I hope, for some conversations, some questions, and my emails and contacts. I really would enjoy a conversation with you and your friends and colleagues about this topic, because I think it's one that we need to focus on. The first theme the homeschooling community, and again, I'm using that in a very broad sense, so however you define it, you can fill in the blank, is a challenge to the political, economic, and social culture of dependency. And first off, what we mean by that is simply that, certainly in the United States, but we certainly see it in Europe, we certainly see it in what was at one time the Soviet bloc, we see it in the East, in the Far East. What we're seeing is more and more individuals, groups, organizations becoming dependent on either the government or on large corporations for their survival. I refer to that as politiers and profiteers. Politiers being individuals who use their power to gain more power by providing and offering assistance, support to other people, other organizations. And then the profiteer is the group, the individuals, organizations that primarily exploit Americans and world citizens, however you want to call yourself, for purposes also of gain, to gain their power. So politiers and profiteers come together, and they're creating what's I refer to as a culture of dependency. We'll talk more about that in a little while, but the considerations under that, and this is where I find it most interesting, is that parents and families are the antidote to the culture of dependency. The whole idea behind this is that parenthood and families and all of that means is not a culture of dependency, but rather just the opposite, a culture of success. There's very few people, in fact, I would find it contrary to any kind of a natural way of thinking about it, that parents, when they have children, that they say, oh, I can't wait for my child to be a failure. Parents look at their children with success, with the idea that our family is going to create a successful home and environment for our children. That's contrary to the culture of dependency. And we'll see a little bit more about that. Second consideration, parents and families represent a check to government control. Parents and families, there's no training manual, there's no book, and certainly there are all kinds of materials out there, but it really is common sense. It's really driven by what I would call love and compassion, trial and error. Parents and families, they make a lot of mistakes, but they learn from those mistakes. And but it's a natural kind of experience. Well, that's very different than the government. However the government's shaped. The government is regulations and rules and bureaucracy and control, whereas in families it's a very different environment. Third consideration when we talk about the homeschooling community as a challenge to political, economic, and social culture is that parents and families are really the centerpiece to our country in the United States, and certainly to any country in the world. They're the centerpiece. There's what drives the country, what drives the economy, what drives the political environment, the social environment. It's natural. It's normal. It's not something that you have to create. It's created for us. And so these three considerations, that parents and families are a challenge to the culture of dependency, they represent a check in terms of what goes on in government and government control, and the third, the centerpiece. Those are the considerations that establish the foundation for our talk today. The next thing is the family outranks the interests of society. Let me tell you what I mean by that. And I'm going to briefly kind of go off on a different path for a moment to let you know what I'm talking about. My experiences of 35 years working in organizing and community organizing and education labor unions and education politics all around the United States led me to the one conclusion, and that is more and more effort is designed to really control and dominate the family. And it's not done in a negative way. It's not done in an adverse way. It's altruistic in the sense that, well, we have to take care of all the children that are having problems, or we have to take care of delinquency. You fill in the blank, and so therefore we have government, and governments has society, and it's in the interest of society to make sure that our children are taken care of. And if parents don't take care of them, well, then the society will. And everyone that's listening and every one of your colleagues you've talked to knows about this, regardless of the country. You know, we have to take care of our kids. If families don't do it, then society will. Well, there's two interests, therefore, that really surface here. Society has an interest in terms of order, stability, productivity in a sense, and families have an interest, and that is seeing their own children, their families successful. And unfortunately right now, we're seeing conflicting interests in those. And so let's get to the considerations. Parents and the family have competing interests with society. Society is designed not to really acknowledge or recognize individuals, and by extension, parents and families. Society is interested in seeing how everyone pretty much gets along, that we have order, stability, and that as a result of that, family and parent interests, the unique interests that parents and families have, are not really as important. They take a minor role when we start looking at society. When we talk about, for example, resources, the resources that society has exist, and then the resources that families and parents have exist. And in most kinds of arrangements, if society's resources are more important, or we need more society resources, then parents and families tend to take a back seat. And so when we talk about schooling, there's general considerations as to what's the needs of society, and therefore our schools will reflect that, which may be very contrary and competing with what a parent or a family has in terms of their values and beliefs with regard to the education of their children. We certainly see that in the faith community. When we start seeing parents that want to have a more faith-based kind of orientation for their children versus society, which is much more secularized. And that's an obvious one, but you can take that example of a competing interest, and you really can start talking about a lot of things when you start tearing apart the various rules and regulations that society has for the schooling of our children. Number two, parents and the family are a natural force that rejects government. What we mean by that is when you raise children, it's really kind of contingency planning. Parents don't sit around saying, let's see, we're going to put together an organizational plan, we're going to have a structure, we're going to have a bureaucracy for how we're going to operate in our home. At least most parents don't. But rather it's messy. It's messy. And government does not like messy things. Government rejects messy things. That's why we have a highly regulated bureaucracy. That's why we have thousands and thousands of pages. For those of you who live in the United States, that's why we have 74,000 pages in the IRS code, because they attempt to deal with every possible peculiarity, every possible uniqueness, and so let's make a rule or regulation. Well, the parents in a natural environment. Parents are natural. Families are natural. And you don't have rules and regulations that operate in natural environments. You have understandings, and you have take it for granted, and there's a lot of unmentionables. But parents and families work in a situation that is very different than the government. Three, the third consideration, what we created society now controls us. This is very important because we now are in a situation, and particularly from a homeschooling perspective and all that that means, is that somehow we created public schools. We've created all aspects of public schools. We've created society. And we've created all aspects of society. You can just imagine and think about it. And now we're acting as if society, the public schools, and all that that represents is separate and unique from us. In other words, that it stands alone and that it controls us It determines what happens in our families and what parents do. It dictates. And we have forgotten that what we have done is created this society. We've created the public schools, and now we're acting as if that they're autonomous, they're separate and apart from us, and that they can control our lives. So that's the third consideration in terms of the family outranks the interests of society. The next thing is that the family is the bedrock of our community. Now that sounds, rather obvious, and it seems pretty natural. But in the final analysis, and particularly worldwide, when we started looking at European community, when we started looking at the United States, Western society, that is becoming less and less significant. But rather, the family really exists to benefit government. The family exists to benefit society. When you think about it, well, we have this driving economy, we have all kinds of things that are taking place. We need to make sure that our children are qualified citizens, capable of assuming their role in the economy. So in a sense, the family then becomes the breeding ground for the economy. The family is now the proper place to make sure that whoever, when you become an adult, then you then can move into society and whatever society is. And the problem with that, while it sounds kind of nothing too problematic, the difficulty with that is that the values and the beliefs that are dictated by society, by the government, are contrary to, in many instances, what families and parents believe. So we have to get back to the notion that the family really is what drives our country, drives society in the sense, and that whatever society is going to be should be determined by the family and not the other way around. So some considerations on this. The family is where our sovereignty and self-governance begins. And I think most folks can start to realize that that's being attacked. That in fact, government determines in many instances now, if not actually, it attempts to do it through public relations, what our children should eat, what our children should believe, how our children should be educated, what kind of morals and values they should have. And we see that now more and more in terms of what public policy is. Well, what that means is our sovereignty, self-governance, our ability to have self-determination for our families and our children are being slowly marginalized. And that's a consideration that we need to seriously consider. With respect to the United States particularly, our founders rejected politicians and profiteers. Politicians being individuals elected to government, and individuals that run our corporations, in a sense, modern day terms. That our founders rejected this. Rather, what our founders said is that families and parents really know best. That we don't need outside experts. We don't need politicians coming in saying they know what's best for our children. That we don't need the corporate world describing what kids should have and wear. And certainly from a superficial perspective, we know that parents are constantly under the pressure from large corporations in terms of how their children should behave. Well, our founders rejected that. And they rejected that not only because it's common sense, but they rejected that also because in the final analysis, it's just going to hurt us. It's going to destroy the family. Parents must be viewed as experts. Parents are experts. What does that experts come from? The day-to-day conversations, the day-to-day problem solving, the day-to-day dealing with contingencies that the family represents. There is more, if we do a task analysis of the family compared to politicians and corporate leaders, parents are much more involved in terms of problem solving, dealing with challenges, than politicians and profiteers ever are. And let me tell you why. The reason is because from a politician's perspective, in other words, political leaders, if they face a problem, they simply put together a new law, somehow assuming that that law is going to solve the problem. From a profiteer's perspective, and I think we see that all over the place in terms of corporate leaders, they simply move from one product to the next. If this doesn't work, we'll come out with another product. We'll move your attention span, this should be less than a minute, and so therefore we come up with more and more, excuse me, sir, more and more products to get people's attention. Well, that's so contrary, and our founders knew that. And the third one, and this is one that we don't give a lot of attention to, happiness and joy begins with the family. The reason why the United States was formed, and again, I apologize to people who are not from this country, but I think you can make the same connection to your own country. Our founders and why this country was formed was for happiness. I know that sounds maybe a little odd in today's world, but it's joy. And that's related primarily to the whole notion of what freedom is designed to be about. The thing is, you cannot, just a second here, okay. Turn this off. Boy, sorry about that. The whole idea of happiness and joy is directly related to the family. That's where it begins. That's where freedom really is there. You can't have much happiness and joy if you're not free. And therefore our families must be in a situation where they have the ultimate freedom to do what's right for themselves as a family and their children. And that then has a major influence on society, on everyone else in general. The next theme is, and this is where we get into a little bit more provocative nature, but I believe strongly that the Second American Revolution, and again, we can consider that metaphorically as well for those that do not live in the United States, but I think this is common now going around the world when we start seeing what's taking place with generations today, taking a look at how power is considered and how governments exist. Second American Revolution will take place they'll take place in our living rooms, in our dens, in our garages that have been transformed into teaching and learning centers for our children. What I mean by this is very simple. When we moved from dictatorships, when we moved from feudal systems, when we move from systems where there have been totalitarianism and authoritarian kinds of regimes, it's been the family unit that has been the centerpiece. Because there's nothing worth risking your life over for than your children. And that's really what the homeschooling movement is about when you really peel back the onions. It's about doing the best for our children. Now that again seems to be, obviously that's what it's about. But if we take that in terms of a political and economic and social agenda, then we need to realize and recognize that what's going to really drive this effort to give the freedom to parents to determine what it is for their children, self-governance, autonomy, sovereignty, then we have to really consider that what's going on in the homeschooling movement is much more powerful than you even realize. Considerations for this. Parenthood is the ultimate joy. There is nothing more joyful. There's nothing more splendid. There's nothing more that gives people absolute fulfillment. And we have diminished that. We've diminished it because we marginalized what it means. We've marginalized what it means because going back to some of the other themes, it's counter to what government stands for. Government, when we start looking at parenthood, is very regimented. We look at the authoritarian states, and what's the first thing that they start to do? They attack parenthood. They control what takes place for children. Why? Because they can socialize children, they can get their minds, they can get their hearts, and ultimately parenthood becomes joy, the joy is removed. A consideration too, freedom and happiness are always connected. I alluded to that a few moments ago. But the reality comes down to it is that without freedom there is no happiness. Without happiness there's no freedom. When we think of the homeschooling movement, freedom and the ability to self-determine, governance, autonomy, sovereignty are connected. But it's connected to one thing and one thing only, and that's happiness. Happiness for your children. It's that freedom that's connected to happiness that we must consider. You cannot have homeschooling, however you define it, however you shape it, unless you have the freedom to do it. And you can't have the freedom to do it unless government plays a minor and insignificant role in your life. The third consideration, parents and families must forge the new social contract. What we're looking at, and what I'm challenging you, and I hope you'll consider, is that the homeschooling movement must look at the new social contract, whether it's in this country or around the world. We must begin to take a look at that the social contract is not based on what government can do for families. It's not based on what government can do for children. It's not based on the food. It's not based on education. It's not based on services. It's not even based on health care. The social contract must be designed by parents and families in terms of what's best for children. That's the social contract. And by doing that, I trust that parents and families will develop children, educate children that can do great things, not only for their families and their parents and themselves, but for everyone else that lives together, whether you call it a society, whether you call it a local community. So continuing now, the homeschooling community, however, again, that's defined. And I'm not here to define these terms. I'm simply here to suggest themes and considerations. This is a work in progress, obviously. Must develop a broad-based political, economic, and social action network. Now, I'm not talking about a social action network in terms of that's limited to the homeschooling community. I'm talking about one that expands into all aspects of our political, economic, and social world. And that's a difficult thing, again, because as most people get into the area of homeschooling and whatever that involved with, the interest has not been to necessarily connect with the political world and the economic world, other than what you have to. So we're looking at some considerations with this, which are very difficult. And the first one is to focus on groups and organizations with common overarching goals. And if we go back to some of our other slides, we're talking about freedom, we're talking about self-governance, we're talking about sovereignty, we're talking about self-determination. And so all of the organizations and groups that are out there, and we see them everywhere, from the Tea Parties to libertarians to individuals who are interested in really setting their own course. These are the individuals and groups that I am suggesting we need to start making more and more contacts with, forming more and more social action networks with, recognizing that if this doesn't happen, then the government is going to become more intrusive. All you have to do is take a look at the news on a daily basis. Just be a cursory reviews of the news. And you see each day that government is becoming more and more intrusive into the lives of our families. One example I'm most familiar with is the charter school movement. When the charter school movement, for example, first came out in California, and I know some folks at this conference are from California, the charter school movement was the wild, wild west. All kinds of things were going on. Now if you go to a charter school conference, you really can't tell the difference between that and the non-charter schools, the public schools that are controlled by the state. Vendors, every type of vendor under the sun trying to sell you something, regulate something, and all of it, of course, aligned with more and more government intrusion into the charter school movement. So if we use that as an example, even the voucher movement, which would give resources to parents, and then the parents would have an opportunity to go to various schools of their choice. Even in those instances, we're starting to see more and more regulations on where it is limited. And I don't believe that that's the way we ought to go. I believe what we ought to do is what our founders in this country suggested, and that is our schools should be local, our schools should be driven by parents and family, our schools should be based on the needs of that parents have, and we should not in any way infringe upon that. But to do that, we have to form these broad-based coalitions. So the first consideration is to focus on groups and organizations with overarching goals, common overarching goals. And you have to decide then, what are our real goals? What are our real goals in the homeschooling movement? What is it that we ultimately want to achieve? And it has to go beyond simply what you want to do for your children. I know there are a number of folks at this conference are highly dedicated homeschooling parents, and you have 2 or 3 children, and obviously that's why you live. That's your purpose. But what you learn as a homeschooling parent, the connections you make with other parents, the connections you have with other children that are in homeschooling, the connections you have with teachers who may not be homeschooling teachers per se, but are helpful and supportive. That's not enough. That's not enough. You need to reach out to other organizations that have similar interests, not necessarily in homeschooling, but interest in having the maximum amount of freedom to live their lives in any fashion they so desire, as long as they do not harm or hurt anyone else. You need to reach out to those businesses that are interested in being entrepreneurs. They may be selling widgets that have nothing to do with homeschooling, but their interest is to be unregulated, to sell good products, to not exploit the public. These are the kinds of groups, and I just mentioned 2, but I'm sure you could think of so many others to make connections with and to have conversations with. The next theme is to make the government live by its own rules. What we mean by that is very simple. That the government, for example, in the United States with Common Core, suggests that these particular standards have to be there because parents either don't have the resources, don't have the expertise, or don't have the time to take care, to do the best job for children. And what we need to do in the homeschooling movement is to begin to articulate that we do have the expertise, we do have the time, we do have the resources to do the very best for children, and that these arbitrary, externally driven standards are not useful. Now, what we mean by playing by their own rules, I dare say at town meeting halls that we've seen on healthcare, for example, when various individuals have asserted their rights to politicians about that the government has shown that it's not truly interested in providing health care for everyone, but rather at this point attempting to figure out how it can simply eliminate certain businesses such as the insurance company and maybe go to a single payer. We have to begin to start questioning at these same meetings and other meetings, town halls, dealing with this homeschool community by asking the government in terms of how, in fact, they believe that external standards by the government are, in fact, going to make our schools better. How, in fact, these standards are going to be really implemented when they don't even know our children. How, in fact, standards that are general can really be applied to every student. And here's an example of rules. The government right now in the United States, and I think this can lend itself to many Western governments around the world, basically suggests that we need to treat people differently. That every group, diversity, every group has special needs. Every group have a special culture, that every group, we need to take them into consideration. And so there's absolutely no standardization there when it comes to dealing with people, but rather the government says that we need to make exceptions everywhere, protected classes, and on and on. But yet when it comes to our children, we can have one set of standards, one set of rules, one set of expectations that apply, regardless of the interests of the parents and the families. Well, obviously, that's completely contrary. And so that's one example of making the government live by its own rules. And finally, the targeting the federal bureaucracy. The interesting thing about bureaucracy, as a person who's examined it and worked in it for most of his adult life, is that bureaucracy is also the Achilles heel of governments around the world. And the reason for that is bureaucracies cannot adjust. It's like, if you can think of a bureaucracy is this large battleship in the middle of the ocean that can't turn. It can't move. It can't adjust. It only knows bigness, rules, regulations. On the other hand, the homeschooling movement is like a PT boat. It can move quickly, adjust, change. And that's so the Achilles heel of the bureaucracy is that we need to begin targeting it. We need to begin tearing it apart. We need to begin challenging it on every possible angle. But you can't do that. You cannot do that if you remain a separate force. That's why we're talking about forming this social action network. And by that we mean taking action at all levels. The final thing at this point is, and this kind of brings it all together, and this is what my passion is, and why I believe all of the previous themes and considerations can be tied up into some clear, cohesive, coherent ideas and message. And it's pervasive into the sense that it really involves not only the homeschooling movement, but everything that I believe is not only good for children, good for our families, but good for really anyone who is truly interested in being productive and doing good work and being successful. And that is to reject the deficit model and emphasize greatness of our families, and most important, that every child has the talents to be successful. Now, I'm sure every one of you agrees with that. I am sure that everyone says, well, that makes a lot of sense, and I agree. But what's so special about that? In other words, why bring it up? Why even talk about it in a situation like this when almost everyone feels that way? Well, because the reality comes down to it is that while it's a rhetorical fact for perhaps everyone listening, it certainly is rejected outright by the government, most governments, if not all governments. It's rejected outright by most corporations, if not all corporations, because the deficit model is designed. The deficit model is designed is to create dependency. Simple as that. It's not designed to necessarily suggest that our students, our kids, our children don't know something, but it's to create dependency. And the reason it's designed to create dependency is because it's directly related to power. And what we have today with the homeschooling movement is one of the last real basic efforts to retain sovereignty and to reject the culture of dependency, the deficit model. Parents are working with their children, and all of those organizations and people that are involved with the homeschooling movement and the homeschooling community reject the deficit model. You believe that your children, the children you're working with, can be successful. And that is a major threat to politicians of all kinds and all stripes. It's a major threat to certainly corporate leaders and the corporate world. And it's a major threat to where society is moving, to become more regulated, more bureaucratic. The deficit model primarily suggests one thing, and that is that the parents and families and children particularly must be dependent on government to become adults, to become successful adults. And so therefore we start off with this great schooling system. And to show you how the deficit model is so corrosive that those that advocate for our schools in the traditional sense do not even see that the deficit model exists. They ignore it. They rationalize around it. We see that in terms of the violence taking place in our schools. We see that in the dropout rates taking place in our schools. And finally, now, we see that in Common Core, standards-based instruction that is externally driven. Because all of those things suggest clearly that the deficit model exists, that our children are problems, that our children must be taken care of, that these problems cannot be solved by parents, that these problems cannot even be solved by teachers, but rather government is the only source. And so therefore you're not going to see the dropout problem solved in our schools, because if you did, then we wouldn't have deficits. Second, you're not going to see violence solved in our schools, because if you did, you wouldn't see deficits. You would. And third, you're not going to see standards leave, because if you did, you would not see deficits. In other words, as long as we have dropouts, violence, and this standards movement, which basically suggests our kids don't know anything, you can maintain the deficit model. And if you maintain the deficit model, you need government. And the more the deficit model becomes acute, the more it becomes abrasive, the more we need government. And so therefore, we have a situation going on right now where government is not going to really do anything. And I think history would show over the last 30 years that my point is legitimate. They're not going to do anything to solve the dropouts. They're not going to solve anything in violence. And they're not going to do anything to solve the academic issues. And then you could fill in the blanks for almost anything else in terms of what they're not solving, I'm sure. You are certainly experts at that because you know what's going on in our school system. And that's a shame. It's a tragedy that's taking place. And so under considerations under that, the deficit model is pervasive, as I said, and it fuels the culture of dependency. It fuels it. Like a drug addiction. We want addicts so the drug industry can grow. I'm not sure if you're aware right now, but in New York City, for example, heroin is almost, you can get heroin for almost nothing. The cartels have become that more powerful. You can get heroin for almost nothing. And so people say, well, why is that the case? You know, why is that? Well, the reason for that is, and I'm sure maybe some of you have guessed it already, is so that people get hooked. And once they get hooked, you can then raise the price. Well, if we look at our schools in a similar way, once it's become clear, and I think we're very close to that now, that our schools are defined as a failure, government isn't going to fix them. Government simply is going to become more powerful and more controlling. And so the homeschooling movement is really the only real check to what's going on, because you're the only force that's out there that has rejected that deficit model by saying that the family and parents want to create a culture of success for their children because of joy, because of happiness, because of love. Second consideration, the strength-based thinking. Strength-based thinking is part of our heritage. It's part of who we are. I'm referring now in some respects to the United States, but I believe that this can be said clearly to all people connected to the homeschooling movement, regardless of where you live. It's based on strengths. Every parent looks at their child through strength-based eyes, through strength-based eyes. And that's what we must do. We must focus on strengths, not on weaknesses, not on deficits. And the homeschooling movement can make a major contribution there. It's not to suggest that weaknesses don't exist, but we don't spend our time on the weakness. We spend our time on the strengths of our children, so that those strengths really become all-encompassing. We only work on weaknesses to the extent that they do not marginalize our strengths. While a public school system, for example, or the traditional school system rejects the strength-based model and only focuses on deficits. Kids don't know this, kids don't know that, and on and on and on. We're here to help you learn, as opposed to we're here to help you build on your strengths. When we look at it as our heritage, and we look at the founding of the United States, for example, the founders were strength-based people. Can you imagine people coming across this country in covered wagons if they focused on deficits? They focused on strengths. The great things that mothers and fathers could do, the great things that they would have talents, they would figure out how to accomplish their goals. They focused on strengths. And from a homeschooling perspective, that's exactly what takes place. I've seen wonderful things occur in homeschooling environments because not just, and there weren't any fancy gizmos or gadgets there or widgets and yada yada and all this stuff, but what came down to it is there was compassion, there was love, and then once the child realizes that exists, strengths pour out. The third consideration, we focus on production and not consumption. We focus on production and not consumption. This is essential. This is critical because right now the non-homeschooling world, if we can categorize it that way, is viewed primarily as a consumption entity. Consuming, whether it's curriculum, whether it's government standards, whether it's external consultants, everyone coming in saying, this is the way you should teach kids, and so people become consumers, very few producers. On the other hand, if we look at the homeschooling movement, it's nothing but production. Constantly looking at great ways, new ideas, new strategies, new kinds of thinking to create wonderful, strength-based, exciting environments for children. Now, again, taking this idea and looking at a social action network, we have to look at the greater society, our world out there. And the bottom line is we're all becoming consumers. Very few people are producing anymore. And as a result of that, the schools then are becoming less and less productive. They're more and more consuming. Kids learn things not for the purposes of learning, but for the purposes of accomplish something. Get into a college. Get the job. And all of those kinds of ideas are counterproductive in the long run because it does not lead to happiness, does not lead to joy, and certainly does not lead to purpose and meaning. And so these three considerations, the deficit model is pervasive and fuels dependency. The strength-based thinking is part of our heritage. It's who we are. It's certainly part of our families and parents. And we focus on production and not consumption, is really the three considerations to consider when we begin to emphasize greatness in our families and that every child can be successful. So this is a summary a bit to tease you in some respects as to why it is the homeschooling movement is so important. And I say that certainly not in a patronizing way. I say that because people will say that to you, I'm sure, and they don't necessarily mean it, or they admire what you do. Isn't it great you take care of your kids at home and all of that, yada, yada, yada. And that's not purposeful. That's not useful. What is useful is to acknowledge and recognize that what you're doing not only is benefiting your children, and for those of you that are connected as consultants and trainers and authors and scholars, you're involved with parents, and you know what I mean. But what we're saying here is what you're doing must be a force for changing all of our political, social, and economic environment. It must be a force. You are the last bastion. I say that because I've seen what the government forces, what their intentions truly are. And I don't know if you can really blame them in some ways, because the reality is it's been a vacuum. There really hasn't been much to fill that vacuum except the government. And so stay the good fight, and you will be successful, but you have to keep expanding. You have to keep expanding. And I want to close by simply saying something here that I believe strongly, and I think it sets the stage for all of us, that love is the final arbiter. And I mean that in the sense of compassion. It's what judges everything in the final analysis. It's a determining factor. There cannot be any creativity without love. There certainly can't be any invention without love. It's the only emotion, really, that allows us to work together, however it's defined. And it's also, in the final analysis, determines whether or not we're doing the right thing, whether or not we are leaving our mark, not only for our children, but also for future generations. And that's why I'm involved, because of future generations. And so I hope that you've enjoyed a few minutes short, and answer and talk about any questions at this point. We'd love to hear your thoughts if we can do that. Are we able to do that, Steve?
Absolutely, and believe me, there's been a pretty significant conversation going on. I think if you have a question for Yale, please feel free to put it in the chat or to raise your hand. Yes, you're getting thank yous, and one of the things that I loved about interviewing you was that you came from this background of traditional schooling, of being involved in unions. It's not easy to put this into the sort of shallow categories that we use currently in politics. It requires some deeper thinking and understanding to address these issues. So I want to express my appreciation of the So I
think I lost you.
Is it any better now?
Yes, better now. Great.
Anyway, I just wanted to thank you. One of the things I really appreciated about the interview that we did together was your own background and the degree to which this isn't easy to put into sort of shallow political boxes. It's a much deeper story, and you've addressed it at a deeper level. If you've got a question for Yale, please feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. One of the conversations, Yale, that came out of the chat over the last few minutes was this question of social movements that aren't mandatory but that spread. And the example I keep using is Gandhi's spinning, the idea of empowering individuals, but not something that requires sort of a high structure and a mandatory approach. Have you thought, or I guess Ergo does this with Start Your Own Schools, or a lot of the food movement people do it with growing your own garden. Is there a comparable way to think about education?
I think so. Certainly, when we consider social media, we've just scratched the surface. And what we're doing, and I'm heavily involved now with fiscal policy and looking at the IRS and taxes and how that affects what's going on, is to begin to take a look at how we can reach individuals that have no interest in what we're doing, and finding out what their interests might be, somehow seeing the overlap with that. But I also have to suggest that while it's inviting and curious to try to take the same values and the beliefs that the people who are attending this conference and so many millions of others, to take your beliefs in terms of that I saw in some of the chat, may not be the best approach either. And what I mean by that is we need to become an army. how that Army's defined and how it's put together, I'm not sure. I'm certainly not the expert at this. But I do know that our adversaries out there are serious. And I'm just going to leave it with that. They're very serious about ending and destroying the homeschooling movement. And if you look at California, for example, and I'll just use California as a quick example, the state legislature up there can end the homeschooling movement with one law, one regulation. Now, it won't end in a minute, but it can end it. And don't think that it won't be done. It won't be tried. And so what I'm simply saying is that our adversary is very serious about destroying this effort, and we cannot be, we need to reconsider that we're fighting for something that is very important and cannot be as philosophical or as reflecting absolutely in our belief systems, but rather we need to fight fire with fire, I guess is what I'm saying as well. That would be my basic response to that.
So Jane has encouraged me to turn the mic on. We only have a couple of minutes. You try and end on time so that people can get to the next session. Why don't we take one more question, either in the chat or by mic if you want to raise your hand. Yale, am I right in kind of identifying the early 1900s as a real period of time of pushback against democracy, against the muckraking journalism, of this idea that there was an excess of democracy and that there was this sense that we needed to control the public voice? Does that come up in your own studies?
Oh yeah, I mean it started basically 100 years ago, and we've been going through it since, to the point now where it's almost things have been turned on their head. And public education, schooling, we can see the same thing in so many ways. So little experimentation from a bureaucratic fashion. I'm not suggesting that experimentation doesn't take place and great teaching doesn't take place everywhere, but that's becoming rare. And I think that's why I felt that participating in this conference was so important, because we need to turn it around. We need to recognize that, go back to our original ideas of why the schools were put together the way they were, the importance of parents the importance of local governing boards and what they were to do, and more importantly, that how our decisions were made in the country. And please, anyone that's interested, who wants to continue this conversation with me, wants to get involved, all kinds of ways to get a hold of me. I'd love to talk with you and engage you further on this.
Thanks, Yale. We do need to stop. Thanks, everybody. If you'd like to save the chat, you can go to File, Save, and you can save the chat. You can also save the whiteboard slides the same way. We won't kick you out of the room right away so that you have time to do that. You can also, in the recording, do the same thing. Thanks, Yale. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Having a great time.
Thank you.
You are too. Bye.